Tonight on Primetime Politics, Randy Boissonnault is out.
We will ensure that your reputation and the benefits you've received from pretending to be Indigenous are removed.
After days of opposition attacks, Justin Trudeau loses his employment minister. Randy Boissonnault pushed aside over past claims of Indigenous heritage. Coming up, we'll examine how difficult this issue has been for Cabinet and the impact it will have on a government already trailing in the polls. Also,
we saw record increases in the national rate of child and family poverty.
A spike in child poverty in every province and territory. We'll look into a new report that says the Canada Child Benefit is no longer helping Canadians the way it used to. And Donald Trump's controversial cabinet picks will get the view from Washington. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Randy Boissonnault is no longer a member of Cabinet. For months, Conservative MPs have been calling for him to resign, at first over a government contract awarded to a company that Boissonnault co-owned. But when Parliament returned this week, the focus of opposition attacks changed, calling on the now former employment minister to be fired because of past claims over his great-grandmother's Indigenous heritage. A report from the National Post revealed this was not true. Mr. Boissonnault apologized, stating the revelation was a surprise to him, but a firestorm was set, and just before question period today, it was announced Randy Boissonnault was out.
The Prime Minister knew that the minister was directing his business illegally from inside Cabinet. He knew the minister had claimed there was another Randy when there was no other Randy. He knew that the minister had falsely claimed to be Indigenous in order to take money away from real Indigenous people, and yet he stood by him up until yesterday. Why is it that he always stands up for corruption on his own side?
The member for Edmonton Centre has stepped down from Cabinet to focus on clearing these allegations.
Well, with more on the development today, we're now joined by Stephanie Levitz, senior parliamentary reporter for the Globe and Mail, and Catherine Lévesque, parliamentary reporter for the National Post. Hello to both of you.
Hello. Hello.
Listen, I want to begin with, what we heard from the Prime Minister in the House. It was also in the statement released today, in that he says that Mr. Boissonnault's departure allows him to essentially address the controversy and clarify what's happening here. Why such wishy-washy language? Does this leave the door open to perhaps maybe one day Mr. Boissonnault makes it back to Cabinet?
Perhaps it's wishy-washy because the answer here isn't clear as to what's happening, and the issues surrounding Mr. Boissonnault are bigger than the debate currently around his identity, right? It goes into the question of his previous business dealings, now with word that the police are investigating some of those business dealings. So there's a lot of things that are swarming around Mr. Boissonnault, and in political terms, it's become clearly a distraction for the Trudeau cabinet as they're trying to get back on some kind of footing, especially in the post-Trump election era, trying to be focused, trying to look disciplined, and they have this issue hanging on them. It just sort of seems, let's just shove that one to a side so we can get back to focusing on other things.
Mm-hmm. What do you say, Catherine?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's deliberately, they use the language and they crafted the statement so that, we can interpret it however we want, right? We can see into that his dealings with his former business partner, Stephen Anderson. It can be anything from his shifting identities in terms of his Indigenous ancestry, can be some of that. So I think they deliberately crafted that statement so that, people could interpret it however they want. But certainly I think, look, I think it was untenable for the government right now. They spent all day yesterday in question period, just dodging questions about Randy Boissonnault. And it just came to a point where they had to do something, or else they were going to be, swarmed with questions every day coming from the Conservatives. And, from what we saw today, I think that was also the Conservatives' plan as well. And they were a little destabilized when they saw the statement just before question period started.
Just before question period, you're saying it, and it did seem to throw them off game, and considering how very concerted they've been every day of this week since Parliament came back. But I want to pick up on your point there, Catherine, about how destabilizing this has been for Cabinet, because of course today was caucus day. Cabinet ministers were asked about Randy Boissonnault before being dropped from Cabinet was officially made known. Take a listen to some of the answers we heard from ministers.
My experience with Randy is that he's been professional in discharging his responsibilities as the employment minister.
I appreciate Randy as a colleague. He's worked very, very hard for Canadians.
And he's been a great colleague, which made great contribution to our cabinet. So yeah.
Okay, so there you have it. You know, a great colleague, but no one is directly or vigorously saying that he's done no wrong here. How uncomfortable, Stephanie, was this issue for cabinet, do you think?
Again, it goes back to uncomfortable in the sense of the broader narrative and the broader challenges facing the Trudeau Liberal government and the general unease and disquiet, not just in cabinet, but in caucus as a whole, that the Mr. Trudeau and his inner circle are too slow to react in moments of crises. And they have these issues that end up, rightfully or wrongfully, dragging them down, knocking them off message, having them defend or talk about things that they don't want to talk about. They let these things play out for day after day after day, and they don't just cut it off at the knee. Whether that needed to happen in this case, that's up to other people to make that determination. But you could see a world in which cabinet ministers and caucus as a whole are saying, guys, come on, like either you're going to address this and deal with it. It's not going to end. If you think you can just, stick your fingers in your ears and la it away, that's not going to happen. And so in this instance, perhaps it's a sign that Mr. Trudeau has taken some of these criticisms to heart and actually is trying to be a bit more decisive, as much as one could say he was decisive after this dragged on for many days. But he was decisive, something happened, and now maybe they can just move on.
Okay, maybe, which we'll get to that in a moment. But what do you say, Catherine? Just how difficult has this been for cabinet?
I think until now they were, cabinet was burying their heads in the sand, saying, well, look, all the ethical dealings, he may or may not had with Stephen Anderson. Well, look, the ethics commissioner cleared him, right? So they could kind of, dodge that. And even his shifting Indigenous ancestry. Look, I mean, it became very uncomfortable for them because even though technically he did nothing wrong, at the same time there was a very fierce reaction coming from First Nations, right? We saw Blake Desjardins from the NDP yesterday saying how hurt he was, and how hurtful it was for the Indigenous community. There was also the Assembly of First Nations, and they mostly kept quiet until now. I know there was a regional chief that actually came out and asked for Randy Boissonnault to resign. And we saw there was a statement just earlier today saying that they were very, very troubled by all these shifting claims. So I think it came to a point where they couldn't just blame the Liberals could not just pin this on the Conservatives and saying that this was Conservatives attacking them. At this point, it was also it was into their credibility in terms of reconciliation. In terms of, all that file was really on the line. So they had to do something.
Yeah, it had to do something. And yes, Indigenous claims seems to be the straw that broke the camel's back here. But as you mentioned Blake Desjardins, he in a news conference today reminded us there still continues to be a police investigation into the business dealings. So Randy Boissonnault is no longer a part of the Trudeau cabinet. But is this really over for the Trudeau cabinet?
I mean, it can't be because there's a privilege motion that still sits on the order paper that is directly related to this issue, right? And we have these privilege debates right now that are gumming up the works of the House of Commons that are beginning to raise questions about government spending. How is the government going to keep spending money? And until this privilege matter with Mr. Boissonnault is dealt with on the floor of the House of Commons, they might not get around to spending any more government money. So the ghost of this lingers over West Block still.
Mm-hmm. Lingers? What would you say to that?
Absolutely. I think that, it's also not the first time that Randy Boissonnault has played fast and loose with the truth. There was, in the past, he's also said that he was a journalist, whereas, some Le Devoir actually figured out that that was not the case. He had written a few columns here and there, but he was not a journalist. Now there were these shifting claims about his Indigenous ancestry. And what Mr. Desjardins also said today was that actually this had been a question that has been lurking in Edmonton, in Randy Boissonnault's writing for years. And, a lot of Indigenous peoples actually had a lot of questions about his claims. So, look, I think there are too many issues right now for Randy Boissonnault. I think, he can't be in cabinet right now, and he can't be such a distraction for the government.
Yeah, we were talking about it a bit off camera before we started, though. It also raises, I think, a big issue for anyone in Parliament in politics right now who wants to create an origin story or tell their origin story about, you can't just make it out of the ether. You have to be very clear about what you are sharing with Canadians. And I don't know how clear the lesson has been, considering so many people have gone down over the issue of Indigenous identity already in this country. Do you think that lesson will now sink in, Steph?
I mean, this is a government that takes a long time to learn lessons and often seems to need to have them repeated over and over and over again. As we were discussing, there was another former cabinet minister, Mariam Monsef, defeated, no longer elected, but she faced claims back in 2015 over her own origin story. And even when that broke, you did not have, clearly, in this instance, everyone taking a look at the claims they were making and just double checking that what they knew to be true was true. And, to give Mr. Boissonnault perhaps the benefit of the doubt here, it is absolutely fair to conceive of the idea that he was repeating a family story, what he had always been told. We've all been told stories by our parents growing up about our origins, about things. Have we ever fact-checked them? I mean, in journalism, I remember being in journalism school and my professor once saying, in journalism, even if your mother tells you she loves you, you check it out. but clearly in politics, that same rule doesn't appear to apply.
Yeah, what do you say, Catherine? Is a lesson learned here as we chuckle over the lesson in journalism school?
I mean, it should be a lesson, and frankly, all elected officials should learn that lesson right now. I mean, if they're making claims, and especially repeated claims over and over, they should actually check their facts and make sure that what their origin story is. And for Randy Boissonnault, it shifted so many times. He was part of the Indigenous caucus, then he wasn't. Now he's saying he was there as an ally. We can't figure out what the truth is anymore. But the truth is that, he was actually a little bit confused. And, he found out just in recent days, thanks to reporting from the National Post, what his origin story was. So, those facts can be checked. And especially when you're a public official, you should really check those facts so that you're not on the front page of the newspapers.
Especially when you're using that identity as part of your political narrative, right? And you're trying to make political gains on your narrative. That's a bit different sometimes than I think other situations. In this situation, he was politically trying to exploit his identity, and therefore it demands a greater bit of scrutiny.
Okay. Well, thank you for this. Appreciate it. It was a late-breaking story. Appreciate the time this evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Canada is reversing a trend, but it's nothing to be proud of. According to Campaign 2000, child poverty in this country has gone up for the first time in years, with a reported 1.4 million children now living in poverty in this country. And it's not a regional issue, with child poverty rates going up right across the country in every province and territory. These findings are part of Campaign 2000's annual report card. And to tell us more about it, we're now joined by Leila Sarangi, the National Director of Campaign 2000. Leila, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on today, Michael.
Listen, I want to start by asking you to paint us a picture, if you will, because when you say that there are more children living in poverty now, in real terms, what does that actually mean? Does that mean going to bed hungry, living in a home with no heat? How does that poverty manifest itself in the lives of children across Canada?
Yeah, it is those things. We go from province to province, to territory. We travel the country. We have partners who work in community organizations across the country. And we hear the hardest stories about the choices that families are making when they don't have enough income to meet their basic needs. So yeah, oftentimes we hear parents are skipping meals because they want to make sure their kids are eating, or they'll buy less at the grocery store because they want to make sure they have enough money to make rent. They are worried about, if I can't pay my bills, what happens? We have a housing crisis, so they're worried about going into arrears and being evicted and then having nowhere to go. We hear about prescription medication. We've made a lot of progress on pharmacare, but we don't have universal pharmacare, and families are struggling with buying prescription medication, and often they are not purchasing those medications for themselves or for their kids. One of the things that we talk about in this report card, when we talk about poverty, we talk about it in a relative sense. So we're not only looking at can a family afford their basic needs, but can they afford the same opportunities as those who are not living in low income? So can I, as a mother, feed my kids every day a healthy meal, but can I also afford to sign them up for hockey lessons? Is my home adequate enough that I can have my kids over and have a birthday party for them and order the pizza and the cake for 10 kids? Those are very normal experiences for Canadian society. They're things that all kids should have, but many are going without, or parents are making big trade-offs to give those kids those experiences. And so when we talk about poverty, we're talking about not just meeting basic needs, we're talking about thriving, giving everybody the same opportunity, no matter who they are or where they live in this country. That is our standard, and that's what we should be striving for.
Now, your report noted a huge increase in the number of children living in poverty in the time between 2021 and 2022. And that's when inflation started to spike, but it got worse from 2022 onwards. Do you have an idea of how the situation has perhaps improved or got worse in the year that followed?
Well, we don't have the data. There is a lag in the income data that we look at. We're looking at tax filer data that gets released annually, but there is a 2-year lag, which is why we're reporting now on 2022 numbers. But when we travel the country and talk to people living in poverty, the situation is not getting better. Families are still struggling, and we know inflation's not increasing at the same pace, but it doesn't mean things are getting cheaper. And families, one of the things we found in our report card is that the families who are in poverty are in deeper poverty. They are further away from that low income measure, which means their families have less income on a day-to-day basis, on a monthly basis to work with. So these families are really struggling. I think when we do our report card next year, and probably the year after, we will not be seeing a reversal in that rise. We don't have any indication that income security programs have gotten better, family situations have gotten better. So we are expecting this for our next report card to show that the trend continues.
Now, you noted,
that's a worry.
Yeah, worrying, as you say. And you also note in this report that the Canada Child Benefit, which, the government has been proud of for taking children out of poverty, you say that's now become less effective due to the rising cost of living. So how does it need to change to address what you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, the Canada Child Benefit, when it was first implemented, you can see in the chart in the report card, in 2016 and 2017, a pretty important drop in child poverty rates due to the Canada Child Benefit. But we don't have more investment into that base amount. It's indexed to inflation, so it's just kind of holding on. But with, wages not keeping up, with social assistance programs being grossly underfunded, we're seeing that there is an erosion in that benefit. So we're asking for a supplement. We've proposed a supplement to the Canada Child Benefit that is targeted to those low-income families, to those who are living in deep poverty. And one of the reasons we are proposing that is because it can be done quickly. We have the administrative capacity. We know who these families are because they're filing their taxes and already receiving the Canada Child Benefit. We just need the budget commitments. It would be a very powerful, quick, and I think easy fix in the short term, because we need other social infrastructure. It's not only about income. We need the childcare, we need the housing, we need the pharmacare, but those things are going to take time. And in the meantime, more investments into income security will really help these families.
Quickly losing time here, Leila, but I know that your organization has made dozens of recommendations that other levels of government and the federal government can follow as well. And I'm assuming you can find that on your website.
Yes, www.campaign2000.ca. All of our report cards are there. We have a national report card, and it's accompanied by our partners in the territories and provinces who write report cards and they talk about what those subnational jurisdictions can do. This is every government's responsibility to eradicate child poverty.
Leila, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Well, to the United States now, where Donald Trump's cabinet picks continue to cause debate. A mix of Republican stalwarts, a dash of lesser-known celebrities, a few picks with controversial track records. Among them, Florida Republican Matt Gaetz, who Trump has nominated to be his Attorney General, former Democrat Tulsi Gabbard, nominated to lead national intelligence, and another former Democrat, Robert Kennedy Jr., who the president-elect has chosen to be his health secretary. Well, with their thoughts on the Trump picks for cabinet, we're now joined by Leila Feldmann, Washington Bureau Chief for the Christian Science Monitor, and longtime Washington journalist David Levinthal. Hello to both of you.
Good to be with you, Michael.
Always nice to have you. So listen, let's begin with some of the controversial choices for the returning president. I mentioned Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert Kennedy Jr. Do what you will, but we're talking about nominees that need a Senate confirmation. Linda, start us off here. Who do you think will have the hardest time getting through the confirmation process?
I think it's Matt Gaetz. I mean, he's, first of all, he's I think not even really qualified to be Attorney General. He has a law degree, but he barely ever practiced law. He's been in politics his whole adult life, and he's never been a prosecutor. So he's what he really is just a young firebrand, very loyal to Donald Trump. And he furthermore has some very controversial issues in his background: sexual misconduct, drugs. There was a House ethics report which they just decided not to release. So people actually on both sides of the aisle want to see this report so that the Senate can make an informed decision. But as of now, it's stuck in that committee.
It's stuck in that committee. You single out Matt Gaetz. How about you, Dave? Do you agree with that choice as having the toughest time?
Absolutely, Matt Gaetz, and I think you can add to that too that he has been loathed by some of his own colleagues, Republicans, who think that Matt Gaetz is a despicable human being and have said as much, including a few Republican senators. So when you add up everything that Linda said, plus the idea that he is going to face absolute headwinds in the Senate, although we'll see how hard those winds are blowing, it does seem that of all the different nominees, including Dr. Oz, Mehmet Oz, the failed Senate candidate and television doctor who's now in the mix as well for Medicare and then overseeing health issues too. I think Matt Gaetz is the one who truly does have the greatest chance, at least at this juncture, and we have some more picks to go, of being shot down. Yeah, controversial, not very well liked. So an eye on Matt Gaetz. But I do also want to talk about Robert Kennedy Jr. because he has stood out for his views on vaccines, HIV/AIDS, antidepressants, and mass shootings. He's tied the two together. But he's also touched on an issue that seems to have had greater resonance with Americans, the impact of industrial food production and the pharma industry on American health. I'm wondering if those issues will make his confirmation process, despite all his conspiracy theories on other matters, whether or not food and pharma will make his process easier, Linda.
So I think he has a better shot at being confirmed than Matt Gaetz. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as you've very well laid out, has many controversial aspects of his record. He's an anti-vaxxer, for starters, which was not a good look during the pandemic. But having said that, he does have his defenders, and his opposition to food additives and all the junk that we eat. I mean, that is something that people agree with, and fighting back against big pharma. So I don't know that he makes it, but I think he has a better shot than Matt Gaetz. Okay,
so it looks like we're playing odds right now. Better odds than Matt Gaetz. Dave, what do you say on Robert Kennedy Jr.?
Well, one thing about Robert Kennedy Jr. is, let's take his last name. He's a Kennedy. And hey, it's one thing to be a lifelong believer, and it's another thing to be a convert. And if one thing is smiled upon by MAGA world, by Trumplandia these days, it's somebody like a Tulsi Gabbard, like a Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who just a few years or a few months ago was talking some serious trash about Donald Trump, and now has switched and gone over to the other side and is squarely on Team Trump. So Republicans in the Senate, and mind you, the Senate, there's just a handful of seats that the Republicans have in a majority. They have to confirm these people. That is a job of the Senate. they're probably going to be pretty keen on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., despite all of the things that we have just covered, for the mere fact that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is now a Republican and working with Donald Trump. That's something that would have been completely not possible even a year ago.
Yeah. To be invited to the Thanksgiving in the Kennedy compound, it would be something this year. But listen, I keep asking about the confirmation process for these nominees, and thinking about Matt Gaetz, thinking about Tulsi Gabbard, perhaps less so Robert Kennedy Jr. But I'm wondering whether or not the president might pressure the Senate to approve, despite all the controversies, or perhaps even recess so that he can approve them without the Senate being involved. Linda?
Yeah, no, that's a distinct possibility. I mean, it is a constitutional way of doing it, but would be extraordinarily controversial. The Constitution does mention advice and consent of the Senate. It's part of our system of checks and balances. And if Trump tries to just wave in this collection of odd characters, I hate to say it, by recess appointments, that will really trigger a huge backlash against him, and it just would get him off to a bad start. I mean, half the country is already terrified about another Trump term and fears of kind of dictatorial behavior. And if he bypasses the usual process of Senate confirmation, that only kind of enhances the fears over what the next 4 years are going to look like.
Mm-hmm. Dave, what do you think? You're talking about how the Republicans do have a majority now in the Senate. Do you think Donald Trump would have to pressure senators, or are they just on side because they owe him or feel as if they owe him for their victories?
People know what happens when they try to cross Donald Trump. Okay, on the Republican side, and if there is internal division, and if folks on the Republican side in the Republican Party are saying, "Oh, Mr. President, we don't want that person who you have nominated and you want on your team and you want in your administration," there is going to be some comeuppance. Okay, another thing too that the Senate provides is it provides a backstop to Donald Trump doing away largely with another, albeit lower profile process, which is background checks for many of these appointees and nominees that he hopes to get appointed. Typically, and even in Trump's first term, there was a series of very rigorous checks to make sure that there were no skeletons in proverbial closets, that there were no instances of illegality, that the nominees were more or less on the up and up. And that, of course, from a political perspective, made it easier to go through the confirmation process. And it also, too, helped Donald Trump avoid and other presidents avoid embarrassment if a candidate really tanks and goes south. But this time around, Donald Trump is just doing Donald Trump. And this is what happens when you're a president who has survived 2 assassination attempts, has survived 2 impeachments, has a mandate from the people, won the election, won the popular vote. Donald Trump is flying high, and we are seeing what happens when Donald Trump feels that way in the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. First couple of weeks, again, some controversial appointments, a lot to watch out for. Of course, the three of us will speak again in future. But for now, Linda, Dave, thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
And that is our program for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.